A brief video here today on Clint Eastwood's 2006 feature Letters from Iwo Jima. One of Eastwood's most acclaimed films as a director, I must say that I agree with its emphasis amongst his filmography. It is a powerful film technically, emotionally, and it absorbs the viewer into its set pieces, an attempt at simulation of these soldiers' psychological duress. Now, any war film can be called into question as to whether it is propagandizing history or glorifying violence overall, regardless of whose perspective it is being told from. This might be considered doubly so when one's subject is a more vilified army in the historical narrative. Not that the Japanese Empire doesn't deserve any vilification, although any audience is less inclined to sympathize with historical villains even if the villainy is warranted. So in Clint Eastwood, almost definitely a proud American patriot to the point of vague controversy at times, seeks to humanistically depict the Japanese soldiers at the Battle of Iwo Jima, and is widely praised across the board for doing so, and in Japan also, one's interest is piqued. And yes, I, who had even then already dismissed big budget war films as mostly vainglorious charades, All Quiet on the Western Front and Paths of Glory, 2 Platoon and Saving Private Ryan, still decided, some years ago, maybe 2015-16 era, to sit down with Letters from Iwo Jima. I was very pleasantly surprised and rather impressed with the film, and have come to consider it one of Eastwood's three masterpieces or near masterpieces as a director, along with Josie Wales and Bird. Flags of Our Fathers, its companion piece, is a technically able film, to be certain, although it lacks the originality, aesthetically and emotively, of Letters. Another quality of Letters less present in Flags is how the action is presented. Flags of Our Fathers is thoroughly attempting to craft something in the tradition, the mould, of patriotic American war films. It depicts the battle as worthwhile and good, a noble epic struggle. And maybe it was. It was probably a net positive, few would argue against that, yet cause for glorification, that is debatable. Nothing is glorified in Letters. There are no action sequences in Letters, there are just scenes of characters being killed. There is a difference, stylistically. Eastwood, or any American director, wouldn't dare, they wouldn't be psychologically capable of, depicting the Japanese victories, or losses staved in this case, as triumphant success. And that's a good thing, by the way, we don't need films glorifying the Imperial Japanese Army. And so they have no choice but to depict war as it is. Horrible, pointless, hopeless, without justification. I found a lot to admire in Letters from Iwo Jima and consider it one of the war films I can commend. This is not an absolute rule which only Come and See can break. I'm happy to appreciate any film, even very evil films, if I find myself admiring it. I'll asterisk it, and that includes essentially any war film by default. Maybe David Lean or Apocalypse Now are exempted, maybe Full Metal Jacket not, who knows, although I happen to admire all those aforementioned titles. Where the likes of those I criticised earlier, which applies to a vast majority of war films, were obnoxious to the point wherein I chose not to admire them technically, and they can be, look at Paths of Glory. Something was different about the exceptions, which caused me to admire them nevertheless. It's a case-by-case basis, these exceptions, and I'm happy to discuss them as they come up. So then it seems horrid of me to have expressed enjoyment of Italian macaroni combat films, especially insofar as I've justified my liking of those films by comparing them to playing with plastic action figures. Although I think those films are so silly and shameless that they just are what they are, knowing slop, more or less, junk food. The films masquerading as anti-war masterpieces which covertly aren't, that is more my issue, I would assume. Not to mention, films such as Saving Private Ryan or even Stone's Platoon. I feel a little bad critiquing a war film directed by a veteran, I will state that. Do not let moments speak for themselves. They cinematically elbow a viewer at every moment, annoyingly reminding them of how they must feel during any given scene. Perhaps because they know the moment will not speak for itself, or will be seen as plainly glorifying violence otherwise. I don't know. The whole concept of the war film, distinct from the trashy action war exploitation film, Macaroni Combat, is an odd one. You know, the war film as a genre, as opposed to just some exploitation slop. It seeks to portray, like epic biblical retellings, the story of how a war saved the world and preserved our present. That might be true, unfortunately, although let's not damage that present by glorifying the military machine or violence in general too much, especially in the context of war. We can't afford any more, too many. A non-serious war film is a non-serious war film. A serious war film with pretensions of anti-war tend to be frighteningly sentimental or inherently romanticizing of war. Some are accepted, in my view, and I'll happily count, due to its particular creative circumstances, Letters from Iwo Jima amongst these.